First Punic Wars, a conflict that would pit two regional superpowers and set them on course for a set of wars. The First Punic Wars would occur from 264 to 241 BC. One party would emerge victorious at the end of them, and the wars would bring about major territorial shifts. By the end of it, Rome would increase its power in the Western Mediterranean. Events during the wars would also set up Roman maritime success for the centuries that followed. The wars wouldn't be limited to one continent, and it would involve several individuals in a battle that would go down in history as one of the significant wars of the era. Differences existed between the Carthaginian and Roman approach to warfare, including issues like how each party recruited soldiers, which tactics would be used, how they would organize themselves, and the use of other resources. Naval warfare would also be characterized by ships known as quinqueremes, and having experienced sailors to sail these ships was an advantage. One that lay mostly with the Carthaginians initially. Period prior to the wars, the Roman Republic had been increasing their territory. Carthage would be another regional power, with great commercial strength. Previous years had seen the two powers at numerous times aid each other, including during the Pyrrhic War. Things would come to head in 289 BC when Mamertimes took Messana. The Mamertimes would seek aid which Carthage would eventually send, and a series of events would eventually lead to the start of hostilities between Carthage and Rome, including the arrival of troops within the region and the defection to the Roman side of Syracuse, as well as events that would see the involvement of a man called Hiero. 264 BC would see the starts of the war. Syracuse at a point in time would find itself under siege. About 2 years later, the Battle of Agrigentum would occur, leading to a Carthaginian defeat. 263 BC. Sending of Roman consuls with forces to Sicily. At some point, in the intervening time, Syracuse would be put to siege. Syracuse surrenders, and Syracuse becomes an ally of Rome. Factors would force the Romans to forage for their food. During this, they are attacked by the Carthaginians. Involvement of Hannibal Gisco in this event. The Carthaginian army, which Hanno would lead, would be made of numerous individuals with various origins, amongst who were the Celts and the Iberians. Hanno is the son of Hannibal. Hanno, son of Hannibal, with the army marches to the rescue of Agrigentum, attacking months after his arrival in the region. Battle of Agrigentum in 262 BC occurs. A battle between the two powerful and influential states of Carthage and Rome. It would see individuals the likes of Lucius Postumius Magellus, Hanno, and Hannibal Gisco. It would involve several interesting events. Included within it was a siege, and would see the defeat of Carthaginian forces, some of whom would be able to escape. Resources would be added to Rome which it could put to use in addition to a new position that was added to it. It would also see the involvement of forces under Roman consuls. Agrigentum's geography made it a position that was easier to defend. Included in this geography were rivers and slopes that were a part of its inherent geography. Several events would occur in the time prior to the events at the Battle of Agrigentum. The events in the city of Messana and the involvement of mercenaries and Hiero II in the events were amongst the most relevant. In addition, the intervention and actions of a Carthaginian commander, who in sending troops would intervene in the conflicts between Hiero and the mercenaries known as the Mamertines, after the Mamertines had asked for aid. The events that occurred in the battle and the preceding time would look more interesting with a look at the context of the surrounding era and a look at what Carthage's interests were and how the events would play into them or against them. Possession of Messana by the Carthaginians would have an impact on the state of affairs at the time, giving them advantages that they could wield in order to gain the territory of Sicily and hamper the interests of one of its opponents in the form of Syracuse. Syracuse's defect to Rome after the defeat of forces that belonged to Carthage and Syracuse and the hiring of mercenaries by the Carthaginians would be some of the numerous events that would follow. In addition to which would be the increasing importance with which Agrigentum would be seen by Carthage and how it would become an important and central base for them, and would continue to be important in some of their affairs. Things would increasingly move towards a conflict between those in Agrigentum and the Romans. Large troops were coalescing around Agrigentum. More individuals would arrive within the walls of the city as they were moved into it. Amongst the forces from Rome would be forces under the consuls Lucius Postumius Magellus and Quintus Mamilius Vetulus. The Romans would find themselves attacked at some point by Hannibal as they harvested crops. Rome lost several of its men in the events that followed. The events of the attack would give both sides information that would guide their future actions, and some changes and events would occur following it, as well as changes in the approach to events that had been unfolding. Several months later, Agrigentum would find itself with a reducing supply to feed its population, and given the developments that had arisen in the new situation they would find themselves in, they would be forced to send for aid from Carthage. Aid which would eventually be sent in the form of forces. Hanno would occupy an important role in this relief force. Several positions would be of importance, including Heraclea Minoa, Tauros, and a supply base at Herbasos. Clashes between these forces and the Romans would occur, with the Romans at times losing men and troops, and being cut off from critical supplies in a series of clashes. Several factors would be involved in the timing of the conflicts and when each side would decide to clash with the other. At times conflict would be avoided. Eventually a clash would occur between the forces, which would see fierce and protracted fighting and would see the Carthaginians emerge as the defeated parties. During this general period, Rome would also face conflicts with Corsica and Sardinia. 260 BC would see the building of ships by the Romans. It also would see Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio arriving in Lipari Island, his target being Lipara, and a counter by the Carthaginians who dispatched ships to the island, under a man called Butes. The Battle of Lipari Islands would occur. Battle of Lipari Islands. Prior to the events at the Battle of Lipari Islands, the conflicts between Rome and Carthage had been going on, and several battles had occurred before, including the notable Battle of Agrigentum, which had seen the involvement of individuals like Hanno, Hannibal, and forces under the consuls. In contest with Syracuse, and several clashes between the Romans and Carthaginians would occur. A naval battle would occur in the form of the Battle of Lipari Islands. Experience was on the side of Carthage, a nation more accustomed to naval warfare. In the past, when Rome had need for any naval assistance, they had leaned on their allies in the form of the Greeks and the Latins for some of that support. But now they had taken the opportunity to develop their own abilities, and therefore build their own ships. But they still faced limitations that they had, and near-instant results would not be a reality for the Romans. The Battle of Lipari Islands occurred in 260 BC and would conclude in victory for the Carthaginians, which up to that point had been the more dominant naval authority between the two, Carthage and Rome. It consequentially also resulted in not only defeat for the Romans but also saw the capture of Scipio, the Roman consul who had been tempted into moving towards Lipara, even though his fleet had several limitations. The event would see the involvement of individuals the likes of Hannibal Gisco, who had been involved in events at Agrigentum, and had been able to escape. Butes and Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio Asina were also be involved. As was stated before, the Carthaginians were the dominant naval authority up to this point, but before to the events at Lipari, something had occurred that would set the pace for a coming change in the trend. The Romans would gain access to a Carthaginian ship, and would study it in order to be able to make their own ships. A process that would fail to yield instant results but would eventually pay off in the long term. Several factors would come into how a dominant naval authority remained dominant beyond the ships and the quality of the ships. Included in the other aspects that had to be considered, was the ability to handle those ships and the changes that had to be made in the way that one battled at sea. In addition to this, the qualities of a ship could determine how one chose to fight, and several changes had occurred in naval warfare. After the events at Lipari, and after other events had occurred, the Romans would come to add the corvus to their ships. It would take time to train a crew in the ways of operating a ship. This would factor into why it was so easy for the Carthaginians, amongst whom was Butes who had been sent by Hannibal Gisco, to overcome the Romans, and why events would unfold as they did with the outcomes that arose from the conflicts between the Carthaginian and Roman fleets. The Battle of Mylae would also occur during this time with Gaius Duilius at the helm. But victory was not as straightforward for the Carthaginians as it had been before, and they would come to face a Roman invention called a corvus. It would result in Roman success. The Battle of Mylae would occur after the Battle of Lipari Islands, which had resulted in defeat for Scipio, and had seen him captured, though he'd be released once again. It would also follow the events that had occurred during the Battle of Agrigentum, which had been in the year 262 BC, an epic battle that would occur between forces from the two powerful and influential states of Carthage and Rome. The Battle of Agrigentum had also seen individuals the likes of Lucius Postumius Megellus, Hanno, and Hannibal Gisco. It would involve several interesting events. Included within it was a siege, and had seen the defeat of Carthaginian forces, some of whom would be able to escape. Resources would be added to Rome which it could put to use in addition to a new position that was added to it. The Battle of Mylae would see several ships involved as well as individuals like Gaius Duilius and Hannibal Gisco played significant roles. By the end of events during the Battle of Mylae, Carthage would emerge as the defeated party in the conflict. Several events had followed the defeat of the Romans at the Battle of the Lipari Islands, and the Romans were forced to think about how they would be able to achieve success on the naval front. Innovations like the corvus would be made and continue to have an impact on conflicts at sea like this one at the Battle of Mylae. The Carthaginians would retreat after losing several of their ships to the Romans, who were now armed with the new contraption. For the Romans, the success here would have several other consequences. Some events would occur not necessarily in 259 BC. After the events in the Battle of Agrigentum, Rome would go on to Mytistratone and then Thermae. Hamilcar launched attacks, also took Enna and Camarina. At sea, Lucius Cornelius Scipio would be able to capture Illyria, but would face resistance when he tried to attack Olbia. 258 BC. Rome retakes Enna and captures Mytistraton, Hippona, and Camarina. During that time as well, the Romans won the Battle of Sulci, which would be between Roman and Carthaginian fleets. The general period would see a greater shift of war to the sea. 257 BC. Battle of Tyndaris would occur during this year, and would involve Gaius Atilius Regulus. Raiding of Liparis and Malta by the Romans, which would be linked to events before. 256 BC would see the departure of a Roman fleet from Ostia. In the crosshairs would be Carthage. The Carthaginians would be able to respond to this growing threat as they were not ignorant of it. Battle of Cape Ecnomus would also occur. 256 BC would see a battle that would end in Carthaginian defeat and would involve individuals the likes of Marcus Atilius Regulus on the Roman side, and Hanno and Hamilcar on the Carthaginian side. It would see the involvement of several ships, some of which would be sunk by the end of the conflicts amidst the fierce naval fighting that had occurred. It would also see extensive and large numbers of forces come head-to-head in a battle that would be noted down in history. The fleet on the Carthaginian side was trying to defend its homeland from the invading fleet of the Romans, who had Carthage as their target. It followed several events like the Battle of Mylae, which had seen the victory of the Romans in a conflict with the Carthaginian fleet under individuals like Hannibal Gisco. A victory which had seen the involvement of the corvus, and one in which the Carthaginians had been made to retreat, having lost numerous of their ships. It also followed events like the Battle of Agrigentum, which had occurred in the year 262 BC, an epic battle that would occur between forces from the two powerful and influential states of Carthage and Rome. It had seen individuals the likes of Lucius Postumius Magellus, Hanno, and Hannibal Gisco. It had also involved several interesting events, and would see the defeat of Carthaginian forces, some of whom would be able to escape. Resources would be added to Rome. It would also see the involvement of forces under Roman consuls. Back to the Battle of Cape Ecnomus. With time, the conflicts would involve more people and more regions, and the theater where the war would occur would change at times. Several changes would also occur in naval warfare as well, including the introduction of the corvus on the Roman side, a contraption which would have a massive effect on the course of naval battles between the two powers. Some naval events would occur preceding the Battle of Cape Ecnomus, including the battles of Sulci and the Battle of Mylae. Prior to the events that would occur at Cape Ecnomus, the fleet of the Carthaginians would pass through several points, amongst which were Heraclea and Manoa. The fleet would be large and consist of several ships. Hanno and Hamilcar would play prominent roles within the Carthaginian fleet. The Roman side would see the involvement of the consuls Marcus Atilius Regulus and Lucius Manlius Vulso Longus, and would be made of a large number of ships as well, that would rival those that had been gathered by the Carthaginians. Both fleets carrying large numbers of forces and carrying a large population who would play different roles, some of them ready for battle on land or at sea. Battle was brewing, and a battle that would see the defeat of the Carthaginian fleet in an event that would be remembered in history. Numerous events would occur after the events at the Battle of Cape Ecnomus. For one, the Romans would eventually find themselves landing in Africa, their initial goal, where they could go on to attack Carthage. Secondly, the Carthaginians that had been spared in the fighting would retreat, recovering as they readied themselves for what would follow. Back to the battle. The Roman fleet, the army under him would consist of several different individuals with different roles. The Carthaginians would make camp. The Romans would move to be closer to the Carthaginian army. Xanthippus would move to arrange his army, deciding where the different groups would be placed in relation to each other. The Romans would act in a similar way, organizing their forces in a way they thought would work best for them. Eventually fighting would start between the forces, and the Romans would suffer severe losses, some of them to the elephants that were present. Latin allies were amongst the forces that were with the Romans. The Carthaginians would claim victory in the conflicts. Amongst the Roman forces, some would be able to escape to Aspis, yet some others would be captured. Amongst those who were captured was Regulus. A battle would occur in its aftermath that would have bad effects for the Carthaginians and would see them suffer some losses. Calamity and loss would strike the Romans as they lost ships and men in a storm. 254 BC. Recapturing of Agrigentum by the Carthaginians. Attack of Panormus by the Romans. Letas, Salus, Petra, Tyndarus would eventually be under Rome's influence. Loss of ships by the Romans in a storm again. 252 BC. Lilybaeum has a naval expedition sent towards it by the Romans. Selinus and Heraclea Minoa are captured. Thermae and Lipara are also captured. 250 BC. Effort at capturing Panormus by the Carthaginians. The Romans were foraging for food when they are attacked. Commander Lucius Caecilius Metellus would play a significant role in the counter on the Carthaginians. The Carthaginian attack would involve elephants whose use would be limited by tactics the Romans used. The conflict at Parnassus would therefore go down as a Roman victory. 249 BC. Roman consuls for that year being Lucius Junius Pullus and Publius Claudius Pulcher, the father of Appius Claudius Pulcher. Lilybaeum is put to siege by the Romans, harbor is blockaded. But Carthaginians are able to supply and support the city. Surprise attack on the Carthaginian fleet is attempted but fails. Also in 249 BC. Roman defeat at Battle of Drepana. Battle of Phoenicia. General period would see major sieges by the Romans on the Carthaginians. By the end the financial state that both powers were was pitiful and the war had cost them many resources. Lilybaeum and Drepana were still held by Carthage. And Rome would build a new fleet, launching an attack which would eventually prove successful against Carthage and resulting in the Battle of Aegaetes Island. The fleet from the Romans had been funded by the wealthy individuals of Rome, making a plea for peace instead, which led to the Treaty of Lutatius and concluding the First Punic Wars. 241 BC. We will look at the Battle of Aegaetes Island. With everything that had occurred in the preceding events, including the momentous Battle of Tunis which had seen the capture of Regulus amidst the involvement of a man called Xanthippus, and which had ended in Roman defeat and Carthaginian triumph amidst fierce fighting. There had also been a series of tragedies that had led to massive losses of Roman ships in storms, which reduced the fleet that would be available to the Romans. 241 BC would see the Battle of Aegaetes Island, which would end in Carthaginian defeat, and would see several individuals involved including Gaius Lutatius Catulus, Quintus Valerius Falto, and Hanno. The battle would see several events occur in its aftermath including the Treaty of Lutatius. In preceding events several territories had changed hands. Sicily was increasingly falling under Roman control and Carthage had ended up losing territory. Some naval conflicts would be won by the Carthaginians, after the losses at sea for the Romans. Enter Hamilcar Barca. Lilybaeum and Drepana remained in Carthage's possession, but a Roman blockade would be effected which would find itself circumvented at different points in time, a huge part of circumventing the blockade of which was played by blockade runners. Several events would occur which would include the capturing of a man called Hannibal the Rhodian, and the building of a fleet by the Romans. Its inspiration being the captured ship of Hannibal the Rhodian. The Romans had repeated what they had done before in using a captured ship as an inspiration for their own fleet, but not exactly. Several things would also occur preceding the battle including the capturing of the harbor of Drepana. The Carthaginians would respond, but their response would take time, and they would meet several challenges. Eventually, the battle would occur involving the individual known as Hanno who would be different to the other Hanno. Roman scouts would be able to see the Carthaginian fleet, and some Roman ships would move closer to the island of Aegusa. The Carthaginians' ships would be met by the Roman ships. Fighting would ensue, many ships would be sunk, many damaged, and both sides would suffer losses. A big factor that had come into play would be the maneuverability of the ships, for which the Romans would have an edge over the Carthaginians, Carthaginian ships having some heavy loads on board. The Carthaginians would lose several ships in the conflicts, some of them being captured. The Treaty of Lutatius would follow, and the end of the war, with Carthage having conditions they had to meet which involved issues around territory and other things. Several individuals would be important during the wars. One of them would be Marcus Attilius Regulus. Marcus Attilius Regulus would be a Roman individual who would play a role within the Punic Wars, and would be involved in several events over the course of the First Punic Wars. He'd be the Roman consul in the years of 267 and 256 BC, and would gain victories against the Carthaginians at several points in time. He would be involved in the Battle of Cape Ecnomus, a battle that would end in Roman victory, and would also be involved in the Siege of Aspis. 256 BC had seen a battle that would end in Carthaginian defeat in the form of the Battle of Cape Ecnomus, and would involve individuals the likes of Marcus Attilius Regulus on the Roman side, and Hanno and Hamilcar on the Carthaginian side. It would see the involvement of several ships, some of which would be sunk by the end of the conflicts amidst the fierce naval fighting that had occurred. And would also see extensive and large numbers of forces come head to head in a battle that would be noted down in history. He would also be involved in several other battles. The Battle of Tunis would be another noteworthy battle. In the fighting that had occurred, a man by the name of Xanthippus would play a significant role. A mercenary who had varied experiences which would come to play an advantage for the Carthaginians, he would initially play a role in training some of the forces before he moved on to be given control of the army. The army under him would consist of several different individuals with different roles. The Carthaginians would make camp, and the Romans would move to be closer to the Carthaginian army. Xanthippus would move to arrange his army, deciding where the different groups would be placed in relation to each other. The Romans would act in a similar way, organizing their forces in a way they thought would work best for them. Eventually, fighting would start between the forces, and the Romans would suffer severe losses, some of them to the elephants that were present. Latin allies would also be present with the Roman forces. The Carthaginians would claim victory in the conflicts. Amongst the Roman forces, some would be able to escape to Aspis, yet some others would be captured. Amongst those who were captured would be Regulus. Regulus would also be involved in making the demands of the Carthaginians that would be rejected. Though the eventual fate of the Carthaginians would remain unchanged in that the Carthaginians would eventually agree to Roman conditions. The conditions the Carthaginians would agree to would be set by the Romans as stated in the Treaty of Lutatius. His son, Marcus, would eventually go on to be consul at some point in time. After the wars, Carthage's foreign troops would rise up against Carthage, and it would come to lose more land, some it including the island of Sardinia. But when they tried to recover Sardinia, they would be stopped in their track by the threat or reignited war from the Romans, and considering the situation they found themselves in, Carthage agreed to back down. This would contribute in their own ways to the feelings of the Carthaginians towards the Romans, which were far from agreeable. Hamilcar Barca in the intervening time after the First Punic Wars would undertake several actions that would add to his stock and that of his family, and over that same period Rome would also expand. Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica would come to contribute economically to Rome. But festering tensions between Carthage and Rome would continue. And an event that saw Saguntum besieged would be pivotal to a flare-up of tensions. The Second Punic War was on the horizon and would see many events. Thank you for listening this podcast into the First Punic War. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel for more. Also watch some of our other videos.